It's Wednesday, April 7th, 2021, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the studio in the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me today are my Missouri School of Journalism colleagues, Kiely and Earnest Perry. And for the first time in more than 13 months, I mean, they are literally here with me in the studio. I'd like to welcome both of you in to the new studio. This is the first time you're here, not with me on Skype. And I think we should go ahead and make sure our audience knows we're doing this safely because we are all several weeks out from vaccination.
Absolutely.
And are happy to be able to be here together.
And vaccination has its rewards, and that means sitting around the table together, which is pretty great.
This is really good.
It's good. It's good to have you both here back with me.
And Travis used the pandemic, like many Americans, to fix up our studio.
That's right.
Yes, we
redecorate.
We did a little bit of remodeling and a little bit of home improvement during the last 13 months, too. So I'm glad for the two of you to be here and to enjoy it with me as I have. On our program this week, a decision from the Supreme Court about former President Trump's use of Twitter. PBS premiered its newest Ken Burns documentary, Hemingway, but is the network too reliant on Burns and blocking out filmmakers of color? And the most talked about rescue pup on the planet, I'm going to ask Ernest and Kathy whether Major Biden's gotten a bit too much press in the last week or so. There's a lot more that we're going to hopefully get to before our half hour is up today, but we're going to start with some of the politics and the headlines around COVID vaccine availability. Later this week, the vaccine is going to become available to all Missourians 16 and up who want to go ahead and get that. We are learning today some of the supply may be going down some, but the availability and the opportunity to sign up for vaccines opening up. It's also opening up in other states, too. The CDC has changed its guidance some and said travel is safer now and fully vaccinated people can visit indoors, like we are, without masks. That's turning the focus in two directions. It's looking ahead on the issue of vaccine passports and back at what went wrong in the rollout of those jabs. If you caught 60 Minutes Sunday night, you saw a fascinating piece looking at Florida, where a wide open rollout led to extreme vaccine tourism.
In some places, seniors waited 17 hours for a shot, but not everyone was so patient. Almost immediately, the line jumping started.
But it was incredibly frustrating.
In West Palm Beach, Mayor James says he was still trying to secure vaccines for his town's firefighters when he learned that at a nursing home in town, some board members and their wealthy pals got vaccinated, even though those doses were only supposed to be given to elderly residents and staff. Then the private jets started arriving. Hollywood moguls, New York socialites, and tourists from overseas were getting vaccinated in Florida, posting on social media and sparking outrage. Early on, there were no residency requirements to get vaccinated in the state.
People were saying, listen, this is a resource and I know it's out there and I'm going to use whatever leverage I have to get that resource. There were no rules.
So the piece went on to describe how the DeSantis administration teamed up with Publix, the large supermarket chain, which also mentioned Publix and its owners are pretty heavy donors to DeSantis's PAC. Kathy, both of those parties, both Publix and DeSantis, have come out really strong against 60 Minutes in the reporting they did in this piece.
Yeah, and I think there's some pushback more broadly on this particular angle of that piece. The thing is, Publix, and I actually tried to look to see what Walgreens gave in the Florida campaign finance database was a little bit gnarly, but the so much for the Sunshine State. But anyway, I think the fact is that Publix is pretty ubiquitous in Florida, and so the idea of using a major supermarket chain, which also has a lot of pharmacies in it, as a delivery point, I think it's hard to argue against that. Mm-hmm. And the one thing, I did not see any of Publix competitors complaining. And so it makes me wonder if this isn't just a little bit of a cheap jab. I think there's a lot to criticize in what went on in Florida, and we can talk more about that. But I really do question whether trying to make a link between campaign contributions and the decision to use publics isn't a bit of a cheap shot. I mean, it's not unusual for a major corporation to give majorly to a gubernatorial candidate, or especially a Republican. Corporations tend to like Republicans. And it's a good way to deliver vaccine. I mean, there's a Publix almost everywhere in Florida.
Yeah, go ahead, Ernest.
Yeah, I think part of the issue that was brought up in that 60 Minutes piece was that many of the Publix locations were not in communities of color and poor communities, and the access for those communities to reach a Publix that had the vaccine available was part of the problem. I mean, I agree a little bit with what Kathy is saying in that you had other distribution outlets. You had Walmart, you had Walgreens, you had CVS, and those were available. So there was some could be seen as somewhat of a jab at it, but what started out as a problem here, I think it was alluded to in the little piece that you said, is that you had people who were able to get access because of wealth or because who they knew. They were able to get access to the vaccine before people who really needed it, the elderly, teachers, medical, and first responders. I mean, that was what really caused people to begin to start looking at who had access and how were they able to gain access, and why were vaccines sent to certain locations in the state and not to others. Yeah, and we've talked about that here. Right. It happened here in Missouri
Absolutely.
as well.
I was going to say this is kind of the fundamental problem is when you don't have a central, transparent government authority taking charge. I mean, the great thing that happened here was when in Boone County was when MU and the Boone County Health Service merged their two lists.
With Boone as well.
And so you knew,
you
knew that it was one and done, you signed up, and it was transparent, and I think there needed to be, and that should have been really done on a more statewide or national basis. So there's always going to be room, and I agree with you that there are a lot of problems in the rollout in Florida, no question about it, and this is one of the reasons they didn't have a clear, easy way where everybody was on a level playing field.
So this was one of those stories where it was almost like they tried to take two issues and bring it into one 17, 18-minute piece. That idea of the access and about the donations and how this had become politicized. And one of the things with Watchdog reporting that we're really looking to do is create change, lasting change, look back on something and kind of point out where there were flaws in a system. When you're talking about what we're kind of hoping might be a 100-year pandemic, what is the lasting change that comes from this type of criticism of maybe a government rollout?
Well, I mean, I think one would be leadership. And what happens when you have a lack of leadership? You don't have the coordinated effort that Kathy's talking about. You don't have someone that says, wait a minute, we know that the vaccine is coming. We need to develop a structure for how the vaccine is going to be given out, when and where, so that people know ahead of time. And I think that's the overarching thing that you're seeing now, and you're going to see in a lot of the coverage as it relates to not only how we handle the pandemic, but also how do we handle the vaccines and everything else that comes with it, is that if you don't have that kind of leadership there and the institutions available to be able to handle it, that this is the chaos that you're going to have, and it's going to affect people dearly. I mean, we have over 500,000 people lost their lives, when now we're finding out, had things been done just a little bit better, that we could have cut that death rate in half, if not more.
Yeah, I think one of the things we learned is, to touch on Ernest's point, is you have to make an investment. And, this kind of just-in-time economy and we'll only have just what we need on hand really doesn't cut it in a crisis. And our lack of investment in public health in the public health infrastructure that really could have helped us get through this pandemic, I think was just absolutely laid bare. And so I would hope that policymakers and people who influence policymakers, like reporters, would be willing to keep the attention on that. I mean, it's very easy to get your attention distracted by the next big story, but being able to sort of say, hey, we need to have a solid investment and have a solid public health infrastructure so that if and when the next pandemic hits, we're ready.
Okay, it's not often that we talk about sports stories this early in the show, but while we're talking about 60 Minutes, I want to talk about a segment from last week's 60 Minutes that kind of got in my craw. Journalists and journalism educators across the country have been talking about John Wertheim's profile on legendary sports writer Dave Kindred. Here's the gist of it. After more than 5 decades covering the best of the best in the sporting world, Dave Kindred retired to Central Illinois and started covering high school girls basketball. It was framed that he was using this time in his life to keep active, doing something he loves, and shining a light on an undercovered area of sport.
The scribe who once described an NBA player as Ichabod Crane on a fast break now called his new subjects the Golden State Warriors with ponytails. And there was something about girls basketball that particularly enthralled Kindred.
I think I owed a little bit to Title IX. The women athletes, I loved seeing them play. And why should they be ignored in high school athletics? The men's game is vertical, the girls' game is horizontal. They have to master the fundamentals. So it's much more fun to watch them. And plus, they don't pout. They don't bitch.
So I have 2 big problems with this piece. And the first one comes straight out of the clip, right? He had 50 some odd years to be covering sports, and he had platforms. He chose now to want to shine a light on girls basketball. And one of the questions I wanted to hear answered that didn't appear in that piece, we don't know if it wasn't asked, but we didn't hear it, was why now? Where was he in the 80s or in the 90s as women's basketball was picking up steam, especially in Illinois, where we had some of the women who really laid the establishment for those Olympic dream teams and for the WNBA? It's like he just discovered that girls are playing basketball and that they can be really good.
Well, I think, part of it maybe, you're right. We don't know whether or not that was not,
It was definitely, it was either not asked or the story was framed in such a way where it was ignored.
Right, absolutely. But to a certain extent, I think it's one of those things where, that wasn't his primary area of coverage. And the fact that during his time coming up, it was male dominated, not just sports dominated, but also sports writing, sports coverage, be it on television, be it on radio, was male dominated, and women's sports was seen as secondary. And in that environment, the narratives were going to be more male centered, and now you're starting to see, not as much as I would like to see, you're starting to see more women's coverage. But you also have to remember that when this piece came out, there was a huge controversy about the way in which the NCAA was handling the men's tournament in Indianapolis as opposed to how they were handling the women's tournament in San Antonio. The locker rooms were sparse for the women, where the food was sparse.
Yeah.
The travel wasn't set up properly, and they were being bashed on that to the point where now the NCAA has an independent authority of team of lawyers basically looking at how was there this disparity between the women's and men's tournament. So I think that had an impact on the narrative of this piece as well.
Well, and that was also, you raise a really good point too about that timing, because this piece came right out of that final Elite Eight game that CBS was hoping to have as the lead-in into 60 Minutes, where it had a feel-good basketball story that came right in that. There was another part of this story that was problematic, and there's a story on our Links blog about this. There was kind of a segment within this 13-minute piece where Wertheim is talking to the girls basketball players about the work Kindred is doing in the coverage. And he was really touching upon how they don't get the same level of attention, even though they've had 6 championships. And where are the banners? Only is it, you can see in the story on the Links blog, there are banners. The girls' names are in there. That there was some kind of, and Wertheim even says in this story that, yeah, they kind of edited it to fit the narrative because it made a really good story, even when they knew the banners were there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's getting in your craw, Amy, is that this is a story, and I could see where on CBS's side they would say no good deed goes unpunished. You know, we were trying to do a nice story about girls basketball, and look what happened. But I think what Earnest said is the reason why people get exasperated, because even now, still, women are second-class citizens, not just in sports, by the way. But and so there's that exasperation and that frustration. But I also think this was a story that wasn't a story about girls basketball. It was a story about Dave Kindred. It was a story about a very well-respected, white, old sports writer and what he is doing. And the girl basketball players were ancillary to that. And I think what people are feeling is, why do the women always have to be ancillary? And so I think that's where we're
that
going.
is
Yes,
probably where I got that I wasn't the audience for the
yes, and I
male
think,
sports NCAA basketball fan at that moment looking for more basketball.
right. And on the one hand, you could say, well, Kindred did have a platform right there on 60 Minutes, and he used it. But I think he meant well. But I also think that underneath that, and the reason there's this backlash is there's this sense that this just never really changes. That women are always there as the supporting cast and not the stars.
Okay, so from sports to sports and politics. There's been a lot of coverage in the past week or so about the new Georgia voting rights law and the messages from companies such as Delta and Coca-Cola and Major League Baseball moving the All-Star game from Atlanta to Denver. Well, on Monday, Texas Governor Greg Abbott sent a letter to the Texas Rangers declining their invitation to throw out the pitch at the first game at opening day because of the Major League Baseball's politics. So the question I ask to the one who started in sports, to the political reporter, who do you send to cover this one? Is it a sports story or politics story?
I think you send the best reporter, or you send both. I mean, what do the sports people think about the decision that's being made?
Do they care who's throwing out the first pitch?
Well, no, but the business of sports does.
Okay,
and I think that's where where the sports story is.
Okay,
not so much what happens in between the lines, but what's happening in the bank account of the team, the bank account of the players and that sort of thing, because this does have a financial impact.
Because that's how you get your free agents.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it does have an impact on them at some point. So I think that you can send both reporters to cover that, because it does have a sports angle, but it also has a business angle. It also has a political angle. So, and it also has a cultural angle. You could send a culture reporter to
which
do that as well.
Which a lot of organizations in the last year and a half have added race and culture reporters as well.
Absolutely.
Well, I've spent many years covering sportlitics.
That's good. We got a new beat there.
Yeah. And I talk to students about this all the time. Our students who want to cover sports, and I say, well, do you know about business? Yeah. Do you know how to read a business form? Do you know do you understand politics? Because I guarantee you, when I was working for USA Today, I was working hand in glove during the steroid scandal. Mm-hmm. It was me and the MLB reporter working hand in hand. So I think increasingly you see this. Sports is a business. It's also a big part of our culture, and everybody has to do a little bit of everything. Right. And if you're a politics reporter, you better know about sports.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a quick update to talk about this week. A decision from the Supreme Court about Donald Trump's use of Twitter. Really what that what that ruling kind of showed, Ernest, was that the Supreme Court was sending it back to the lower court saying, we don't really have any jurisdiction here anymore. The guy's not the president.
Right. They actually said it was moot. But what's interesting is that Justice Clarence Thomas basically came out in this brief and said, but at some point we're going to have to look at this. And I'm paraphrasing him, but eventually it's going
to come up again,
and
it's going to get to us
and
before that person's out of office.
Yeah, it will come up again because other cases have been decided using the precedent that was set in the Trump case earlier. And what people are upset about who are wanted to see this precedent upheld by the court is that it was erased by mooting out the case. But this is clearly something the court would rather not deal with. But I agree with you, Amy. I think it's going to come their way. They can't avoid it.
Yeah. And they're going to have to deal with it because, are we talking about a business or are we talking about a entity, institution? And when I say institution,
Is
I'm talking
Twitter
about
a private room, like a private restaurant?
Right.
Or is it a public forum?
Right. And does that mean that the First Amendment does apply or does it not apply? That's what they wanted the court to decide, and the court basically punted because Trump is gone.
They did the whole who's going to bust the tables at overnight camp, and everybody at once put their finger on their nose and said 1, 2, 3, not it.
Yeah.
Well, so we wait for the next case. Yeah. Ken Burns' newest documentary is running on PBS stations across the country this week.
It's hard to imagine a writer who hasn't been influenced by him.
In order to have something new to write, he had to have something new to live.
And he fell in love quite a few times. He's complex and deeply flawed, but there he is.
Hemingway, the man, is much more interesting than the myth.
But nearly 200 filmmakers say that the network needs to do better, that Burns dominates its airwaves, and in turn, directors and producers of color are being shut out. The consortium that signed this letter signed it as Viewers Like Us, a play on that underwriting tagline that PBS programming is possible due to the contributions of viewers just like you and me, and that we, the three of us at least, aren't Ken Burns. The timing of this criticism isn't coincidental. They are coming out with this specifically because Ken Burns is back everywhere on our TVs this week.
Yeah, I mean, and you can't knock what he does. I mean, he is at this particular moment would be considered the leading documentarian in America, and he has this contract with PBS to do tons of hours of pieces like Hemingway, the Civil War, baseball, you name it, you go online. But what they're saying is that by giving him that kind of a platform, it limits the ability of other documentarians, in particular documentarians of color, to be able to also have that as a platform. And thus, what about the public's right here to be able to see it from others, and the fact that it is public television and there are donations coming in, but there's also this other implied sense that the government has some sort of involvement here, and it shouldn't be just the platform for this one particular white filmmaker.
And let's talk about that mission for just a second. That idea that these are even more so public airwaves, and that public television has a obligation and a mission to grant even greater access to diversity of voices. It's interesting that you brought up baseball and the Civil War, because much of this critique that has been going on ultimately for several months, but bubbled up in the past couple of days, was because of how the CEO and president of PBS responded to an essay written by a woman named Grace Lee, and specifically called out how baseball and how the Civil War were produced and constructed, and how the narratives of people of color were limited or not included in the same ways that documentaries that were produced by people of color may have addressed those issues in different ways. And the president's response to that was, well, but we also have contracts with Stanley Nelson and with Henry Louis Gates, so it's okay.
Right. And that's part of it. And even Stanley Nelson signed the agreement. Even Gates himself at certain times have said we need to do more. So, and you also have, I mean, you don't see a lot of Hispanic related or Asian American related documentaries on there. You see one or two maybe a year. Henry Louis Gates is the second most prolific documentarian on PBS right now. And so, PBS said, well, hey, what about this? Yeah. And then, Stanley Nelson has done a lot out there, but there's still other voices, in particular, younger voices of color that are not getting those opportunities. And I think that's where the letter writers are really going with this, is like, look, if you really want to build PBS and say that it's public, then you not only do you need to deal with it from the standpoint of people of color, but also think about it generationally, and that's another problem for PBS.
I think you hit it. The generational thing is a really key problem here. I mean, PBS tends to go back to the same safe handful of people time and time again, and my biggest beef here is, Ernest Hemingway, really? I mean, really? We need another documentary on Ernest Hemingway? So I think the tendency is to go for that safe cultural icon and not to talk about writers of color, women of color, and would we have a different view? I think we would if we had some younger documentary filmmakers given an opportunity. So I think it's, as much as it is an issue of color and it is also, and gender, it's an issue of generation. Let somebody else, not that Ken Burns doesn't do wonderful work, he does, but let somebody else try a hand. And I think it's great that they raised a voice in protest.
Okay, so before we go, I've got to ask you about
the big story.
Yes, about Major Biden. This Biden son, air quotes, is the one who nipped at two people while out on a walk and who may or may not have pooped on the carpet in the White House. Not the one who released a book this week. This dog has gotten a lot of attention in the news media in the last 10 days or so. I have to ask you, is the first dog biting at people news? Should this dog be getting the level of attention that it is?
Oh, come on. Everybody loves a dog story. I mean, we all know that, right? From the business, if you had a dog story, you had to put it out on the front page. It's just people love it. So should it be getting a lot of coverage? Maybe not, but we're talking about it right now. So
we are, as Mike McKean used to say on this show all the time, we have to show that we can walk and chew gum at the same time. What aren't we covering? Because we're covering the dog biting people and pooping on the rug.
Well, I mean, we could be talking about infrastructure. We could be talking, and we have on the show talked about the vaccine distribution and that sort of thing. But sometimes you have to find these other kinds of stories to let people know that there are other things going on in the world, and there are other things going on in the White House other than policy and politics.
It adds a human touch.
There's poop. I'd like to thank everyone for coming back and joining us. I'd like to thank both of you for being with me in the studio today. You can read more about all the topics we talked about on our links blog under both the programs and podcast tabs at KBIA.org. You can download our podcast from wherever you get your podcasts, such as iTunes and Spotify. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. Our handle there is @ViewsOnKBIA. I'd like to thank Travis McMillan for directing today's show, Aaron Hay for handling the audio, Tim Pilcher for our theme music. Take care.